Welcome to the Defense News webcast, exploring the defense budget for fiscal 2023. I'm Joe Gould, Pentagon reporter for Defense News. This afternoon, I am joined by the top two experts on the defense budget, so they can break it down for you. Joining me today is Todd Harrison, Director of Defense Budget Analysis and the Aerospace Security Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and Mackenzie Eaglin, a Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you both for joining me.
Yeah.
We invite our audience watching to send us questions throughout the session by clicking the Ask a Question button below your video. And I will try to get to as many of these questions as possible throughout the webcast. All right, so about a week ago, the Defense Department budget for fiscal 2023 was released with a 4% increase, which is not likely to satisfy congressional Republicans, and it's seen some vocal pushback from at least one Democrat. The two cliches about budgets are, which you guys know well, is that the president proposes and Congress disposes, and the other is that budgets are a statement of priorities. So what can you tell us are the big takeaways for you about this budget? Maybe I can start with Mackenzie.
Sure. I think the big takeaway is inflation, right? So the department is struggling with it just like regular Americans, all of us, struggling in different ways, right? And in different, just the sheer magnitude of purchasing that the department does every year and using different inflation assumptions for each of sort of sector. So that's a challenge, as we'll get to later. And then it was a lot of what we expected it to see. There's more divest to invest, the approach that this leadership team started last year to basically mortgage the present for the future, the research and development programs in particular, and then record R&D spending again. That was the bumper sticker last year. I think that's similar. Now, record is a relative term with inflation. Nonetheless, we'll give them, in just the sheer dollar amount. That's the priority for this team is the war of 2030 and beyond. And I guess the summary of all of that is, so it's a smaller, older, less ready military, and that's a risk they're willing to take.
Todd?
Yeah, well, obviously inflation, big story coming out of this budget request, and I think that's going to be one of the big factors on the Hill as they consider the budget throughout the summer and the fall. I would say, just to add something different to what Mackenzie said already, I would say one of my big takeaways was the Army kind of got by without much, without much done. Not nearly as big of an impact on the Army as it might have been, as we might have been expecting. So, maybe one of the stories from this is the Army lives to fight another day. Now, they did have some reductions, don't get me wrong, a slight reduction in Army end strength, but nothing huge. And some of the major, Army acquisition programs that we thought might be on the chopping block. One I had predicted back when we had our budget event together back in early February. I predicted that Future Vertical Lift and FARA in particular, that helicopter program, might be on the chopping block. From what we can see so far, and again, not all the details have been released yet, but it looks like it didn't get cut. And so, I think that's a good news story for the Army, even though, there were challenges in other parts of the budget.
Do we have a sense yet of why that might not have happened as expected?
It's considered one of the top 6 modernization priorities, and the leadership made it clear they would take risk in other areas, including end strength, to protect those priorities to the extent that they could.
Well, and also they did not have the forcing function of, as tight of a budget as they had been forecasting in the past. So, if you look back at last year's request, what they were projecting for the top line budget for this year, that would have been tough, something around $730 billion. So they got, a significant increase from what was previously planned, so they didn't have to make as many difficult choices. Now, a lot of that increase is getting eaten up with inflation, or will be, depending on what happens with inflation in the coming months. But, I think they didn't have as tight of a budget situation.
So one thing I wanted to make sure before we dig too deeply into the substance of the budget is I wanted to see if we can establish how this rollout was different in that many of the details that we will often see in a budget rollout didn't come this time. So if you could both break down for us what we don't have yet, we still don't have yet, and why that's so important to the debates that we're talking about.
Well, the biggest difference is it was 2 months late. It's supposed to be released the first Monday in February. That didn't happen, and so we're late into the process right now, especially the congressional budget process. But then when it was released, part of the reason some of the documents are delayed is that Congress had only recently, a few weeks ago, enacted the FY22 appropriations. So they like to update those documents to include the FY22 enacted and alongside the FY23 request. There just hasn't been time to make all of those updates. And so some of the key documents on DoD's side we're still waiting on. And those are, to get into budget terms, your P40s and your R2s. Those are your detailed budget justification books that go item by item.
The J books.
The J books, yes. They go item by item, project by project, and they give you the 5-year projection at that itemized level and a whole narrative description of what they're doing. So those are delayed. If you look on the website now, it says they're delayed till mid-April, which, what does mid-April mean? That could be April 25th, I don't know. But yeah, those have been delayed. The other unusual thing is on the OMB side. OMB, normally on budget day, you go to their website around 10 a.m. and boom, everything's posted. All the historical tables, everything. You can click, it's all right there. That didn't happen. They had a delayed posting of those normal budget documents to the OMB website, and I am still not entirely sure why that was.
I want to jump in though on how egregious it was the budget data was late when they're still not sending over the 22. If they needed the time, so let's go back here. All the numbers were locked months ago, including the inflation assumptions, as multiple briefers from the department have said. They didn't relook the strategy or the budget for 2023 because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So there was no reason for it to be late. If you were just waiting on the 22 enacted, well, we're still waiting on that. So that wasn't the reason they're late. So then Congress is doubly outraged, as they should be, frankly, that it's late.
They could have submitted the documents with FY22 either being last year's request or leave it blank, right? And then follow up with that column of data filled in. They had all the numbers, you're right.
Do we have any indication of why this happened in this way this time, or unclear? Not totally clear.
Unclear.
Because last year, I think when the budget came out late, there was a justification that there was some, tumult in the transition between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and so administrations in their first year tend to start off late. But here we are in the second year, late with less information.
Well, I mean, this is a part of a larger trend. It's not just the Biden administration. The Trump administration, in its 4 years, never submitted a budget on time. The Obama administration, 8 years in office, they only submitted 2 budgets on time. So this is a trend now, and it's something that lawmakers, need to be asking questions about. And quite frankly, I think it's something that the PPPE Commission that Congress created to study the budget development process, I think that's something they have to address.
I agree.
This is late budget requests.
And aside from the budget numbers, I wanted to touch on they've represented that this is a strategy-informed budget. The strategy was released to Congress, the National Defense Strategy, the update for the 2018 strategy from the Trump administration, but only publicly released have been like 2-page summaries. And do you want to talk a little bit about what we could glean from the little information that has come out from the strategy document?
Sure. And also here, supposedly, there will be an unclassified version, potentially in May or later. But that's a challenge. Let's just go into the logistics of the Hill. And Joe, you know this well. Even members on committees of jurisdiction of national security and defense don't make time to go to SCIFs to reclassify documents. It's hard, it's time consuming, it gets bumped for other reasons. It's hard for staff to manage that. So to think, I mean, I'd be curious how many members have actually gone down and read the classified version. Probably less than a dozen. I feel confident I could take that to Vegas. But what we do know is there's more continuity than change from the 2018 National Defense Strategy. China is the first among equals threat. So, you know, they talk about Russia as acute, as in, I think, immediate. I guess we could parse that word a little more. But over the long term, it's just, it's China. It's number one priority and focus, an area of investment when there had to be choices made. So in terms of like force-sizing construct, war plans, that sort of thing, not sure. But in terms of ambition, the two documents are basically the same. And that boils down to what the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Eli Ratner, testified as saying, you know, China is the pacing threat, Taiwan is the pacing scenario, and it's a strategy of deterrence by denial, specifically. So that's what we know.
So to turn around back to inflation, to dig in a little bit deeper there, you know, of course, the number one friction point you guys have both identified for this budget is going to be inflation, and you've both said in different forms that the administration's inflation rate is unrealistic. If the Biden administration is off target with this inflation assumption, how off target are they, and why would that be?
Well, so I'll start with this one. So first of all, let's be fair. You know, you have to make assumptions about inflation when you're putting a budget together. To put a budget together takes, you know, several months to put the final touches on it and get it all in the proper, you know, format and everything and publish all the documents. So they had to make some assumptions about inflation back in the fall. And it looks like from OMB's documents that they snapped the line around November 10th. Right? So they made these inflation assumptions. Any kind of economic assumption can be political. So, right? So there's reasons you might want to make it a little higher, reasons you might want to make it a little lower, but you're making a guess anyway. You're doing it with the information you had, in this case, as of November of last year. I think at that point, the administration was still optimistic that inflation would be transitory, as Jay Powell on the Federal Reserve kept saying. More information has come out since then, and we now are starting to realize inflation is higher than we thought, and it is staying higher longer than we thought. And we're still not going to know what inflation will actually be in FY23 until a few months after FY23 closes out, right? So there's still a lot of time here, a lot could change. But here's the assumption they made is that the GDP change price index, the main measure of inflation you use in the budget, they said it would return to 2.2% in FY23. Given what we know now, that seems highly unlikely. What is, you know, a better assumption? Probably somewhere around 4 or 5, maybe 6%. It might be more likely. 2.2 seems really incredibly optimistic.
And to be clear, the 4% increase over last year is 1.5% real growth, roughly, right? That's
well, when they say 1.5% real growth, they are using that 2.2% inflation number that was built into the budget. So if I were DoD, I would say don't talk about real growth or anything. Don't talk about anything in inflation-adjusted dollars because we have so much uncertainty about inflation right now. Just give everything in current year dollars, and people can judge for themselves. If the budget is growing 4% in, you know, unadjusted dollars, you can adjust for yourself and decide, is that going to be more than inflation or less? I'd be willing to bet it's probably going to be at inflation or maybe slightly less growth than inflation.
And Mackenzie, do you want to weigh in a little bit here? What's the what's the cost here of having a budget that's out of step with inflation?
Well, not only is it, you know, more dollars chasing fewer goods and services for the department, just like it would be in like a family budget, right? So that's a challenge. But it's also a compounding problem. So last year's budget also below inflation, including congressional ads, right, which were quite generous, 29-ish billion roughly at the end of the day is how much Congress put in this priority above the president's request. The intent behind that growth was 3% above inflation. And now that number looks like it's at inflation, give or take. And so Congress is going to also be worried about, well, we wanted to add money for specific priority theaters like the Indo-Pacific region and specific things underneath that priority. So that's going to also see a lot of changing and shifting. So this compounding issue, so whether it's 1.5 points above inflation, I agree with Todd, let's just not even use the talking point. What I do know is if the Defense Department or Congress wanted to match pre-pandemic spending for the defense budget this year from 2019, you'd be looking at an $850 billion defense budget, and I don't mean the money that includes the Department of Energy.
What's the, I mean, I think we're already seeing some pressure from Congress to get around this inflation number. But what's the likelihood that something's going to shift here? And also, like, what's the cost if it doesn't? We know where inflation hits, us as consumers at the gas pump, but is, eating up to the Defense Department's buying power translates into what for procurement programs?
Yeah, I mean, that's where you have to separate between the political debate about the top line budget, right? And is it keeping pace with inflation? Separate that from the nitty gritty, program by program, how much does it erode your buying power? That can vary quite a lot. In part, it depends on, do you have contract awards where you're up to renegotiate price, right? And that's when you go to renegotiate a price, that's when industry is going to factor in their own higher labor costs, their own higher material costs.
Yeah.
If you already had something locked in at a fixed price, fine, they're stuck with it for now, although there are exceptions where they can come back and ask for increases, due to, unforeseen circumstances. The other one is labor costs. Now they, already built into this budget a 4.6% pay increase. And that's something that I think Congress might have to come back and revisit. Now that is based on the Employment Cost Index, which is a broad measure of wage growth in the overall private sector economy. But the Employment Cost Index is backward looking. So that 4.6, that is the ECI as it stood as of October of 2021. So when they're starting the new fiscal year in October of 2022, it's a year out of date, right? And we may continue to see significant movement in the labor market that compels Congress to say, hey, instead of 4.6%, we're going to give you something maybe more than that to account what's happened in the past year. So those are specific ways where it can start to erode your buying power, line by line, program by program.
And the expiration of the child tax credit hits a lot of younger enlisted families that were also receiving that, and Congress is going to be doubly sensitive to all the different ways this is impacting service members and their families. So for example, I totally agree with you that they're going to want to lift higher. It kind of made the defense briefings a little more difficult to swallow because, one senior official said, we don't buy food. Okay, but service members buy food.
Yeah.
And they are buying food at 8%, inflation or whatever the grocery store, like we're all seeing. And I can't find anywhere that in my family's budget where the cost of something went down in the last year. I mean, if you have one, please raise it at the table and tell me. But those two challenges are going, I think Congress is going to be quite sensitive and want to go far above the 4.6.
I think I've heard both Mike Rogers, the top Republican on House Armed Services, but also the chairman, Adam Smith. I mean, I think they've both talked about taking care of service members in this environment. So it gives you a sense that maybe we will see some activity around cost of living increases or taking care of service members amid this record inflation.
Well, and there is some new program apparently that I have not been able to get any information on or been able to ask any questions about yet, but I want to look into it. They appear to be proposing something called a basic needs allowance
Yes.
that is supposed to be geared at service members that might have more, issues, with food security. I imagine that is a very, very small number of service members. If you look at pay at the junior ranks, you would have to have a remarkable number of dependents in order to have some, serious issues like that. It does happen from time to time. So I'll be interested to see how much does that program cost, who does it apply to?
And thanks for reminding me, Joe, because last week we saw our Senate ranking member, Senator Inhofe, and House ranking member, Mr. Rogers, send a letter to the Secretary of Defense outlining their concerns and questions about inflation, about the assumptions that the department leadership used in building its budget. And they are extensive and specific. So that should tell you right now kind of where the starting point is for the Hill in thinking about markup.
And this is my last question on inflation, but it seemed like, with Republicans laying down a marker, the Deputy Defense Secretary, Kath Hicks, at the budget rollout, seemed to suggest that the Pentagon will work with Congress, or that this was going to be, we talked about inflation being a moving target, that they're going to somehow get there together. Any hopes of that?
I mean, I think that reflects reality, right? That, you send the budget over to Congress. Congress is going to take it apart. They're going to tinker with it, and they're going to put it back together. And so, ultimately, DoD will be going over there, talking to them, answering questions like this about how they're accounting for inflation, how it's affecting them. And most importantly, more economic data is going to come out between now and when Congress ultimately enacts this budget. So I think that will be factored into it in the end.
So, so this budget, like the last budget, emphasized China and Russia, and this request, as you touched on, Mackenzie, boasts the Pentagon's largest R&D budget yet at about $130 billion for new weapons like hypersonic missiles, but it would retire some other systems like the LCS, the Littoral Combat Ship, also the A-10, popular aircraft on the Hill, which defense officials have been arguing isn't relevant to a high-end fight. So there's some continuity here with this, the administration wanting to divest from legacy, what it calls legacy platforms, to reinvest elsewhere. Can you guys talk about some of the divestments that we're going to see, and or some of the divestments that are getting proposed, and what kind of pushback we're seeing already or should expect to see, and maybe even what's likely to actually go through? Will the administration be successful?
Sure. So I think we're getting to one of the big questions, aside from inflation, that Congress is going to have to come to terms with, because the department has settled, it seems, on their answer. And that's, do you believe the Admiral Davidson window, right? That the possibility for Beijing to decide taking action against Taiwan is a 6-year, now a 5-year window problem, a here and now problem. I think Congress is very sympathetic to that view. This budget is not. And so that's where the two branches of government are diverging. And so that's how they can justify a lot of these divestitures. It is so much more than even the ones you've outlined, Joe. The Army, the Navy, and the Air Force all get smaller, older, and less ready in this budget. And you can take that risk if you believe that the challenges are further out into the future. Department leadership in the budget briefings talk about, how they took like a 3 fit-up look at the problem. That's a 15-year window where they were trying to sort of shape this budget to think about, when they're not even going to have these jobs, the people who were making those decisions. So on one hand, that's kind of a laudable thing to do. On the other hand, I think Congress is looking around the world saying things are really bad now, so why risk capacity? Let's go, I'll just briefly touch upon, because it's all kinds of aircraft for the Air Force.
It's like 150 is the number that's stuck higher than 150?
Higher than that. I'm trying to pin it down myself as well, but I believe it's somewhere between 240 and 260 aircraft.
Wow.
Not just fighters, right? So it's all
This
cargo.
is where having the detailed J-books matters.
Right, exactly. For the Army, it's rotary wing capability and Army vehicles. Not every vehicle. Like there's some winners like the JLTV, but the rest are not. And then for the Navy, it's all kinds. It's not only the ships that are going to retire, which is 2 times greater than the new build, two and a half times actually,
It's 24,
to 8.
something like that. There's 24,
24
Navy,
retiring
Navy
ships
vessels.
to 8 new construction.
Right.
It's not 9, as Senator
9 if you
Inhofe
count
tweeted
one from
about,
before.
which Congress said you're not allowed to do that in previous defense
Yeah.
bills. I'm glad Senator Inhofe reminded
What did they do? They double
everyone.
dipped. They kind of took credit for.
For one that was already.
It's already been authorized and approved, right? So it's 8 new construction ships, but then, and the ships they're proposing to retire have so much service. I mean, one of the LCSs the hull's been in the water for 2 years. The amphibious capability, combined, they have 25 years of service life left in them. Congress is not going to take this well. But then you look at the programs that are canceled or truncated or slowed, there's a lot of those, and they're only trickling out because of this, budget data that's only also trickling out. But I can give you a couple of different examples, like the LPD amphib, right? So that program was supposed to be built of record to 42. This is the last year the Pentagon were proposed building it at just 32. So that's ending the program 10 ships early, for example.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Tom.
Yeah, no, so I would say this is one where Mackenzie and I often can finish each other's sentences and agree on a lot of things. This is one where I think I disagree a bit, that I think that it is smart to make a lot of these divestments. And I take your point about the timeline of the threat, especially with China potentially thinking it can take a move on Taiwan in 2025, 26, or 27. That's what people are saying in the intel community. With that point taken, I look at some of the divestments, and I don't think they would play in that scenario anyway. You're not going to use an A-10 in that scenario. It's not going to get anywhere near the fight. LCS, not going to get near the fight. I think that some of these platforms are things that are just wasting assets. They're great platforms, don't get me wrong. Well, I can't even say that about the LCS. That was an acquisition mistake, right? But like the A-10, great platform. It's just we don't need it anymore. We've got other ways of doing close air support. And you know what? Close air support is not a high priority mission in this strategy. If we're realistic with ourselves, it's not about putting large numbers of boots on the ground, moving in large formations, taking over territory, pushing out an enemy. That's not what you do in a fight with China. That's not the primary mission. So I think we do need to look at divesting some of these platforms. And honestly, I would say that even if the budget environment was completely different, even if we had an $850 billion budget, I would say still you need to divest the A-10. And we ought to be investing that money elsewhere. And LCS, I mean, you got to, at some point, you got to stop throwing good money after bad money.
And so Todd, we'll have to go to happy hour soon, because we agree actually on what would be relevant in the fight. The only sort of comma Mackenzie would add to the rest of that sentence. So good news, we always still agree. But I would just note though, that's when the shooting war starts, or the hot war, or whatever we're calling it. But most of what the military is doing every day around the world is trying to sort of keep the unsteady peace. So it's the presence, assurance, deterrence, dissuasion, persuasion missions. And for that, I'm okay using 4th gen fighters. I'm okay with using, coastal ships or whatever, just because being there, one ship, one place, one time, for example, you just need numbers sometimes. But totally with you on the
How successful has the administration been? This is like the second year that they've made this divest or reinvest argument. Did they manage to, how well did they do in the FY22 budget cycle that they're returning to this strategy? What's Congress likely to do to these requests already? I think we're starting to see the unfunded lists from the services land on the Hill. I think the amphib that you mentioned is the Marine Corps is asking for it back or has put it on its unfunded list. Elaine Luria, who's a centrist Democrat on House Armed Services, said Biden's budget sucks, was her word, because it in a tweet, because of the way that it deals with ships, and she's a sea power advocate. So was the Biden administration successful before, and how might this play out?
I would say the administration was more successful with divest to invest last year than any previous administration in recent years, so probably since like the tail end of the Obama administration. Part of that is The services have gotten better, as in a little more political in making their case, like the Army through its night court a couple of years ago, and different secretaries realize, learned the playbook that you kind of got to get in front of problems with the Hill, but not in front of Joe Gould's headlines, right? So you got to sort of give them previews. You have to let them know what's coming, sort of get them on your side, make the analytical case. The Air Force also, their leaders have spent time getting everyone on the same set of talking points, understanding why decisions were made in the past so it doesn't look like a bunch of flip-flopping, which it really was for many years with different leadership. So the services are getting better at making their case, and they have top cover from OSD in the White House in that approach, right? So if you look at, last year, the White House, what they were threatening to veto the bill over, right, includes some of the rejections of the divest invest. But overall, they were pretty successful, including aircraft, which has been the last, if you look in the defense bills, aircraft floors are more common than almost anything else in terms of telling the services a level they cannot go below. But even the Air Force was largely successful. So I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing them continue that in this budget. And I think they'll have less success this year, but not because of all the reasons I said that they're getting better at it, but because of the capacity challenge.
At the risk of opening up a can of worms, I'll just F-35. I think was in this. That's
going to be an interesting one.
Yeah. So that was there's less of a buy proposed by the Biden administration than expected there. So
on the Air Force side is where you got to look on the F-35 and what the change has been there. So just for setting perspective here, the Air Force was supposed to get up to 60 aircraft per year of the F-35A, and they had been there because in some recent years because Congress had been adding additional planes more than the Air Force had been requesting. But the Air Force had been requesting 48 per year. Now for FY22. Congress did not add any more F-35s, so the Air Force is only getting 48 in the FY22 budget. The plan was they were going to ask for 48 again in FY23, but they didn't. They came in and asked for 33. That's a pretty significant reduction. It's a bit, eye-popping. And the messaging on that, has been a little muddled, but I think it basically boils down to they want to wait until Block 4 capability has been, fully rolled out into those aircraft. Why buy something that you're going to have to come back and upgrade later? And so they're slowing down a bit on that. And then in the interim, they doubled the expected buy of the F-15EX. So buying new 4th gen aircraft. So instead of buying 12, they're going to buy 24 in this request. So almost, evens out there. But yeah, I think that's something Congress is going to take a hard look at. What I am still waiting to see is the Air Force did this tactical fighter study last summer. And then apparently Secretary Kendall came in and wanted to review that himself. I want to see the final results of that. What is the Air Force's long-term plan in terms of how many fighters of each type, of each variety that they want to keep in the fleet long-term? Because ultimately, I think that will affect what Congress is willing to let them do in this budget.
They've managed to get some buy-in, as you were saying, Mackenzie, but this might be a test of how much buy-in the Congress actually is going to have.
And to the arguments Todd raised that Secretary Kendall talked about in terms of technology refresh of Block 4, yes, Congress is going to hear him out on that. But where they're going to start to throw BS flag, if I could say that on the air, is over this zero-sum approach to a 4.5 gen fighter and 5th gen fighter. These don't swap mission. One doesn't fill in for the other when you cut one. And Secretary Kendall has also said he wants to keep the A variant buy reduced until the F-15EX purchase is bought out. And that's, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but at least 3 or 4 more years. No chance Congress is going to accept that argument.
If I can turn to, I want to do Ukraine next, but before we do that, nuclear weapons, always a source of, partisan tug of war. What do we know about the nuclear modernization investments in this budget? The Biden administration redid its nuclear posture review, the strategy document. It could have gone big, but I don't think it did.
We don't have the nuclear posture review.
Yeah.
So again, it's kind
Based
of
on the two-page summary, it doesn't look like they've made it.
yeah, but kind of again a missed opportunity of this administration, to get the strategy documents out there first, to make the case for what they're going to do, and then follow up with the budget. But they're leading with the budget, so it's a budget-informed strategy, right? At least that's the perception it gives. But I mean, bottom line is the major nuclear modernization programs, all three legs of the triad, they continue as planned in this budget. And that goes back to the Obama administration making the deal with Congress, for New Start back in 2010. So the bomber's in there fully funded. We do see procurement funding over the FIDEP for the bomber for the first time. And for GBSD, the new ICBM, now that it's got procurement funding built in there apparently. And Columbia class, the sub-leg of the triad. So all those are in there. Where they're going to be arguing, I think, in the NPR is over semantics, things like no first use or sole purpose, right? Which, at the end of the day,
declaratory
policy. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter that much because you can change that in a dime. And we're looking at I think the contentious issues are the low-yield nuclear weapons and the sub-launched nuclear armed cruise missile, two things the Trump administration added in the last NPR. And I believe they have taken the sub-launched missiles out in this budget. Again, if we had details, it would be interesting. But that was a program that never got started, right? And so it's easy to cut something that never got started. And honestly, I don't think the Navy really wanted it. But I don't know if you have a perspective on that.
Well, all right, so Ukraine. The Pentagon officials have said at the budget rollout that it was finalized before Russia invaded Ukraine. So I wanted to ask you guys, how does the Ukraine crisis factor into the conversation to come over this budget? And to be clear, it did include about $4.2 billion for the European Deterrence Initiative, which was an increase of $360 million, including funds for Ukraine. But Congress just passed a budget for FY22 that had about 13.6, if I'm remembering that figure correctly, for to address the crisis in different ways. So what's going to happen with this request?
Well, I think the assumption by department leadership is an accurate one, which is that Ukraine's an emergent, changing, shifting issue. So whatever we need will come over through emergency supplementals, and I think Congress will be more than supportive. I think that was the right thing, the right call. It's too soon to start putting those kinds of shifts into the budget request, I would argue. I actually think there's a possibility of two supplementals regarding Eastern Europe posture and Ukraine-specific funding this fiscal year. But again, but what do we see? I think the leadership of the department says that the European Deterrence Initiative was largely successful because of, it didn't stop the invasion, granted. But for example, look at pre-positioned stocks that were refreshed, modernized, rehearsed with. You got to take everything out, you got to test it, you got to make sure the parts still work, you got to drive vehicles and things like that. So that you had Army units, out of like Fort Stewart falling in on the pre-positioned stocks within a week, firing weapons on a range. That's a remarkable thing to have accomplished. And so it was kind of a validation of all that investment. I don't think that it's the end of the European Deterrence Initiative kind of focus because of Ukraine. So I think whereas it may have wound down under another scenario, it will continue under some form or budget tagging exercise. Particularly as the increased posture, it's not a really an if, but a when, meaning, or I should say how. Those 10,000 additional troops and the ones that were there, it's only a question of will they be permanent or rotational forces and things like that, not will they stay forward for a while. So those are the kinds of things we're talking about, but the money will follow.
We're talking about potentially a changed force posture on the eastern boundary of NATO, and but there's also, I think in just Friday, the Biden administration asked or approved another $300 million in weapons for Ukraine, not from the Presidential Drawdown Authority, meaning like not from the existing stocks, but from these are maybe going to be new contracts, or maybe we don't know, maybe they're going to draw from existing contracts and include different kinds of drones, armored vehicles, machine guns. So maybe there's going to be some procurement associated with with these increased Ukraine funds. Should we see them?
Yeah, well, and the supplemental funding for Ukraine that Congress already passed, it did create pots of money that were really flexible, and so we'll continue to see things that fall out of that. And to Mackenzie's point, I think it's entirely possible we could see another Ukraine supplemental before the end of FY22. It is just way too early to know what at all the department might need in terms of FY23 funding to support what's going on in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. I mean, who knows where this conflict will be 6 months from now. But I think if there's a need, Congress has shown it is more than willing to accommodate that need, whatever the cost.
So we touched on, I think at the top, you made some points about Army. We were talking about Navy and some of the political support. I wanted to ask about Space Force, because the Space Force budget saw an increase, but there might be less there than meets the eye, and I wanted to see if you could explain that as
I don't follow
as a
it because
Space
she
Force
does.
Space Force expert.
This is one of the first things I tried to dig into with the budget. So, Space Force funding for FY22 enacted by Congress was $18 billion. What's proposed in this request is $24.5 billion. So some people look at that and they're like, whoa, that's more than a 1/3 increase. That's huge. Well, not exactly. So about $4 billion of that increase is actually just transfers of funding that previously existed elsewhere in the budget. So the Space Force had not previously had its own MILPERS account. Their personnel were still being paid out of an Air Force account, so they moved that over. Now they got their own MILPERS account. That's $1 billion, but it's not new money. It's just Air Force MILPERS went down by $1 billion to slide that over. And the Space Development Agency had previously been funded outside the Space Force. They were independent of the Space Force, but in FY23 they're going to move under the Space Force, so their budget moves with them. So that is basically the rest of that funding that's transferred. So really it's only about $2.5 billion increase in new funding without the J-books. Can't see exactly where that money is going, but I did notice one thing that caught my eye. It looks like they're going to restart production of what had been a Navy satellite program in the past called MUOS. It's for narrowband communications. I'm a little shocked that they're actually restarting that program. When you could go out, you could get Iridium sat phones with a similar, much cheaper capability today that is technically better in many ways, but I look forward to seeing the justification documents to see why on earth are they restarting that program.
And do you know there are personnel caps at Space Force? I remember that initially there were space. Are those still in effect? Are we still?
They are.
Okay.
Yeah, on the military personnel side, so you do see the end strength of the Space Force in this budget. It shows it going up by 200, but those are transfers, right? So they can move billets, personnel positions from other services, but my understanding is they're still capped. That they can't add new billets. I think that is one of the smartest things Congress did in setting up the Space Force to prevent bloat and to prevent kind of overhead headquarters staff from ballooning like they have in the other services.
Yes.
They have kept it lean because of that. And so I think that's a good thing. And I think the Space Force, you look at what they're setting up, it is a pretty flat management structure. As much as they can, they are flattening things out. And I think that's the way to go.
So I wanted to kind of take a look back at the FY22 budget cycle. As we look at, okay, how is this all going to play out? We're in the second year of the Biden administration. Midterms are coming up. What does we've got this very sharply, evenly divided Senate. What did the dynamics of the FY22 budget cycle tell us about how this might go, and how do midterms potentially impact this next cycle?
So the bottom line from the 22 cycle is that there are more votes in Congress to increase defense above the president's request than to maintain it or cut it, period. That trend won't change. In fact, it may actually grow a little bit because of Ukraine. And so that's point one. Point two is there's, and it's bipartisan, although it's kind of more one-sided than the other. But the second point is that the increase from 22, which I spoke of earlier, was generous. And I think final enacted somewhere just under $29 billion above the Biden request. I think Congress will seek to make that a larger number this year, not just for inflation, but other reasons. And the intent was to buy more of the 2018 defense strategy, to put more focus and emphasis faster and sooner on the Indo-Pacific region, and then some other sort of just reduced buying power, compounding challenges that I talked about also earlier. Those were the sort of three reasons behind that growth last year, and those three are all only more urgent, I think, this year for the Hill.
Yeah, and one thing I would add, building on what Mackenzie said, is if you look back at the debate about the defense budget a year ago, so early days of the Biden administration, you had some progressives in Congress, really on the House side, who were talking about a 10% cut in defense, and they were, relating that to we're pulling out of Afghanistan. We ought to be able to take, a 10% cut. Now, that never had any serious chance of becoming law. But that kind of was the position progressives were staking out. I don't hear that anymore. And so we know that in FY22, once the votes were cast, there was much more support for increasing the defense budget rather than decreasing it. And I think that, the forces that have been trying to pull the budget to a lower level, I think that they have largely evaporated. They're not going to be focusing on that as an issue. And so I think there is more upside potential in FY23.
I wonder if politically it's the combination of, Ukraine being kind of front of mind for everybody with the, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think if progressives are going to bring up reductions in the defense budget based on the withdrawal from Afghanistan, then they're bringing up a sore topic for the administration, which they might not want to relitigate in an election year.
Yeah, I think the administration is still reeling a bit from the perception that they had with the Afghan pullout not going well, and making them look weak on national defense. I think that they're hopeful that what's happening in Ukraine actually makes them look stronger, make people forget about what happened in Afghanistan, because what we're doing as in support of Ukraine right now, I think does seem to have a lot of support. And Russia is imploding on itself, so that's that makes it easier to succeed in what they're trying to do. But I think that inflation is a much bigger issue now, and with the midterm elections, I don't think Democrats want the midterm elections to be about national security. That does not work in their favor. So I think that they want to keep this debate pretty simple, pretty quiet, and if that means giving Republicans what they want, I think we might see more of that.
And what do we know, or what predictions do you guys have about the timing of all of this, right? So they've put out the top line. I mean, there was a big dust up in FY22 between Adam Smith criticizing the administration for coming in so late. To me, it feels like the administration might be trying to have it both ways here by putting out some information to kind of kick off the posture hearing season with, and then not being totally ready, so they haven't put out all of their justification documents. How does it all play out here? And what about the midterms as like a backstop on the schedule, right? Everybody's going to want to go home and campaign at some point.
Typically, midterm election years freeze legislative action. It's just, and the closer you get to the election, the less that gets done. So that's interesting. I don't think that will be any less true this year. But it's weird. In our other events where we've been talking a lot about this, I said, and yet I'm optimistic about not final passage. I'm not thinking that we'll get a defense policy bill or spending bill before the midterms. But I am optimistic the committees will finish their work on time. Most of the committees, 3 of the 4. We all know who's the holdout. And that, and you may even see floor action in 1 or 2 chambers on 1 or both of the defense bills. So that's good, because whenever the midterms, I think Congress will want to move more quickly than, I know we've talked about next spring in getting this done. The the more they can sort of get through that process, the faster even a lame duck Congress could move it in December. So I'm not as pessimistic as I usually am.
Oh, wow. I am pessimistic. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, what sets the defense budget is the appropriations bill. And I have very little confidence that they're going to get an appropriations bill, any appropriations bill, much less defense, passed, before the elections, if they're going to, do it by October. I don't think there's an incentive there for Republicans to want to go along with it because, look at the polling, and there's a pretty good chance Republicans pick up one or both chambers. They can get a better deal if they wait until, that new Congress is sworn in, not just on defense, but on non-defense as well. And so, I think every incentive is there to just kick defense and all the other appropriations bills off until January. And then when you get back in January with a new Congress, they don't pick these things up right away. So then you're really looking at February, maybe March before they pass it.
So we're back in a similar situation. This is a great segue into audience questions because I have one sitting here that says, what makes you think the budget in any form will be enacted in a CR environment in an election year? And I think what you're saying is you don't think it's going to be it's going to be enacted in an election year. We're likely to see a CR to about the same point that we saw this year, right?
That's what I would think.
I hope not, but right. It's a guarantee we'll start the fiscal year in a CR. We totally agree on that. It's only a function of can you get it done through a lame duck? And I guess it depends on how big the shellacking is.
Well, and then, you've also got to then think ahead for the FY24 budget request. If you've got 23 is delayed till February or March, are we not going to have the same excuses about the 24 president's budget request also being late and being submitted to Congress? Maybe this time next year.
This administration is starting to remind me of what it's like to try to get my kids out of the house in the morning, It's just always a big struggle. Okay. So that's a good segue into some of the questions here. Here's one. For either guest, what are your thoughts on the March 31st White House memorandum on presidential determination on Defense Production Act related to strategic and critical materials and how the U.S. current foreign reliance on sourcing materials such as rare earth elements are addressed in the budget? Anybody want to take that one?
I do not know how it's addressed in the budget, but the Defense Production Act is written to be very broad, and so the administration could use it in a lot of different ways. It's not entirely surprising to see they would be using it this way for certain metals and things that are critical to keeping the economy moving. That's what it's there for.
Right. I think we're seeing some executive action. Who knows how long this train is going to take to leave the station, but there's some executive action in the meantime.
Yeah.
Another one is, in a typical year, how often have we, this is going back to the timing, in a typical year, how often have we met the scheduled release dates for budgets and also prior year document updates? I think you're probably the person
I put this in reports before. I'll see what I can remember off the top of my head. So the first budget of a new administration, always late, in modern times. That's nothing new. But the subsequent budgets, we were in a period, if you go back to the Clinton administration was only late in one budget other than its first. And it was only a few days late, and I think it might have been a snowstorm in D.C. When that happened. It was like a government shutdown and everything. But then you look at the George W. Bush administration, and every budget other than the first was on time by the statutory deadline. And then, like I said before, you get to the Obama administration, it's suddenly changed. They only had 2 that were delivered on time. Trump, 0, and so far Biden is 0.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a trend that is continuing.
And then let me add the trend on the back end. That's the front end. The back end trend is no better, which is continuing resolutions, as we're talking about in these questions. And there was one year in the last 15 that the appropriations were enacted on time. And then if you kind of look at the totality of it, basically, if we look at just the last, so Jim Mattis, when he was secretary a while ago, in 2018 said 1,000 days of CRs in 10 years. But fast forward to today, and if you add it up, it's even now it's worse. It's like 3 2/3 years under a CR in the last decade, and that's the department-wide. That's not a great, that's just begging for inefficiency, wasted money, wasted time, just so many other problems.
I'm chuckling to myself because now we have both sides of this equation pointing the finger at each other, talking about unstable budgeting. You know, now you have Congress pointing at the administration saying, get your budget in on time, and then the administration pointing at Congress and saying, pass the budget to stave off CRs. All right, we're in the home stretch. I've got a question here. We touched on the PPPE Commission. Any hopes and expectations or recommendations, since you guys are the experts, for the newly launched PPPE Commission?
Wow, I mean, it's a great commission. You look at the members on it, a lot of good talent there. They also have a lot of hard work ahead of them. I mean, I think one of the big challenges is trying to build an internal process within DoD that is modern, that is agile, that can react quickly to changing circumstances, because that is the new reality that we live in. That, you know, inflation assumptions may have to change suddenly. Pay raise assumptions may have to change suddenly. You've got new technology programs that now all of a sudden need funding, and they weren't in the POM process, right? You can't have a process, an industrial era process that takes 2 years to get something into the services POM, their draft budgets, you know, all the way into the president's budget, submitted to Congress, and then enacted in appropriations. That takes too long. And so I'm hopeful that they'll be creative, they'll think outside the box, and they'll try to come up with, you know, some better solutions to help fixing the process to make it more agile. And then taking into account as well, we got a dysfunctional process on the congressional side. And I'm hopeful that they'll make some recommendations on that as well.
Yes, high hopes for this commission, but there are a couple of challenges. One is the longevity of it, and although maybe that'll take the politics out, I guess, if we're kind of well past, I don't know. But it makes me nervous, you know.
Meaning if they set up recommendations that'll take an effect in somewhere down the line, folks will be more apt to.
Well, no, the scope of the commission's work is beyond a year's time frame, whereas most commissions tend to kind of start and finish within about a year. So I don't want Congress to lose interest. I don't want them to miss the window of actually affecting change in the department, because I also think urgency is really one of the watchwords here across whatever board we're talking about. But high hopes in terms of what they can recommend. The more specific they are, the greater chance of success they'll have in terms of, you know, if they're actually writing sort of proposed legislative texts to match their ideas. And the more consensus there is by the commission, I think also the more success they'll have.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think the Congress has warmed up to the ideas of like multi-year pots of money, building in some flexibility. I feel like this was something that maybe we saw back under Defense Secretary Mattis, and appropriators seemed a little bit more interested in that. Have we seen that trend continue? Or?
Well, they've dipped their toe in the water in terms of you know, potentially changing the titles of the budget and the colors of money with this pilot program. They call it 6-8 funding, so they put it under research and development. But it's a pilot program where you're specifically focused on software development or software-intensive programs. And the idea is, when you're developing software, like, what is the difference between development, production, and maintenance, right? You're kind of doing all three of those at the same time. It's kind of all mixed together. So why do we have separate pots of money for development, production, and maintenance? So this was a pilot program to combine it all together and let DoD manage it that way. I think there are actually a lot of stakeholders here that folks might not, you know, be cognizant of at first. You've got to get all those stakeholders on board and comfortable with it. It's not just Congress, you know, and they've got different factions, the appropriators, you know, that are providing the money, then the armed services committees that are doing oversight, right? But, you know, it's within the Pentagon, it's the services, it's the comptroller's office, and importantly, OMB, the White House Office of Management and Budget. You've got to get them comfortable with having these different pots of money, or even proposing pots of money that don't conform to kind of the structures that they're used to. So I think, this commission, I think that they've got opportunity here, but they've got to make sure to involve and to convince all of these stakeholders, including the institutional forces within DoD and within OMB that need to go along with this.
Right. All right, well, I think that got us to an hour. This is a great conversation. Thank you guys so much. We've come to the end of today's discussion. Thank you again, Todd McKenzie, for joining us. As a reminder, a recording of this webcast will be available on defensenews.com. Don't forget to register for the C4 ISRNet conference on April 20th. You can register by scrolling down and clicking on the registration button, or by going to c4isrconf.com. Thank you for tuning in, and have a great day.